El señor Víctor Dover nos hablará sobre urbanismo sostenible y planificación de carreteras. Bienvenido.
Hola, buenos días. Mi esposa es cubana, and she's sitting right there, and so that's all of my Spanish, Mark. I thank you for allowing me to do this in English. I promise I can go faster that way. I bring you greetings from the Republic of Miami, and thanks. Thank you very much. We're very honored and flattered to be able to talk about this important subject with you, and not just on behalf of myself, but on behalf of a big group of practitioners in all sorts of disciplines in our office, but also in the greater movement to restore logic and coherence and love to human settlements. I think, based on the title of today's conference, we're really here to deliver a little bit of a challenge to your definition of green building. Let's say you could approach things a couple of different ways. Let's say you could build the most beautiful building. It's a beautiful tower with a striking silhouette, let's say. And we carefully install on this building low energy glass and low flush toilets and highly efficient air conditioning and ventilation equipment. But then you stick that building in an out-of-the-way, far-flung location. And you surround that building after putting it down into the middle of its parcel with parking. And you equip that beautiful silhouette of the top of the building with a base of the building where human beings go back and forth at the ground plane with a pedestrian hostile, blank wall kind of environment. What this does is dooms the occupants of that beautiful building to drive everywhere, every time. And so all of the effort to reduce the energy load of that building, all the effort to reduce the emissions caused by producing energy or carrying on human activities in that building, and instead built a beautiful street and lined that street with trees that shaded its beautiful sidewalk. And we equipped that building with its grand silhouette with a beautiful storefront or balconies and doors and windows facing the base, and create a relationship between the occupants of that building on the inside and the world and the public realm outside that building. The result of that, maybe we could add some other things. We could add some bike parking and some showers for the office workers if that's an office building. The result of that would be we could take some of that driving and reduce it. We could take some of what the technicians call vehicle miles traveled, VMT, and we could eliminate some of those miles. We might be able to eliminate some of the trips altogether. We might be able to take some of the trips that were long and make them short. We might be able to make some of the trips that were for single occupants in one car, one person, and instead replace them with walking or biking or using transit. That's, in a way, much of the vision that Marissa beautifully presented this morning. It means that green building goes beyond the building. It goes beyond the building envelope. It includes the neighborhood. This is why a few of us in the new urbanism, in smart growth, and in environmental politics a few years worked with the U.S. Green Building Council, your counterparts in D.C., to create LEED for neighborhood developments. Imperfect though it may be, it says green building is also about location, not just technology. Green building is also about the connected and walkable streets, not just the gadgets or the interior. So this challenge has a second dimension, which is that just as we urge in environmental thinking people to reduce, reuse, and recycle, in urban development, we create addresses. And these addresses need to be set up so that they are fit and desirable to reuse and recycle, so that when we redevelop on that lot, what we redevelop comes back more valuable, not less. And we want to avoid doing things in the plan of the city that cause the individual parcel to be less recyclable, to sterilize your ability to pull more value out later. This is why I believe that your sustainable city in the future will boil down to largely the design of that public realm. largely to streets. Now, I'm a big enthusiast about street design, and that's because as urban designers and town planners and architects, we are in the before and after business. What we have to do is look at the places that we know and imagine how we would change them into the place we would rather have or that we think would be more valuable. This is in our hometown of South Miami, and that's the US Highway 1, for those of you who know that area. The existing conditions and what if. We make before and after pictures. You saw a lot of them in this morning's videos. Before and after pictures let us glimpse the world as it is and then visualize, not just verbalize, qualitatively describe, not just quantitatively describe, how it could be better if we made the effort to think about how the buildings go together in a set, not just how the individual building is better. So I want to talk about this from the point of view of reestablishing confidence in building that coherence and logic and love into the city. In the United States, we have reached a point where a lot of development, even ambitious and mild-mannered and sweet urban development of the sort of NOMA that Mark described, is met with resistance. And so we have to reestablish our confidence that we can have growth and change that makes things better rather than worse. In fact, many of the people in an audience this size back home would be convinced that growth and change make things worse rather than better automatically. Then you have to persuade them that once upon a time we built cities which were better as a result of growth and change, not worse. That confidence is absolutely crucial to achieving the green building objective, and I'll try to explain why. To do the right thing for the environment, we have to convince ourselves to live closer together and to spend less of our time and our fuel in vehicles. That's a tall order for world populations, not just North, Central, and South American populations that place a great deal of value on tranquility and on privacy. We have to say, live closer together, it would be good for you. That's a little bit like saying to an elementary school child, eat your beans, take your vitamins, they're good for you. Most of the time people don't do things just because you tell them that it's good for them. But suppose they did it. Suppose they decided to live in compact cities rather than spread out ones. Suppose they lived in places that were served well by transit, as Mark described, and there were alternatives to all the driving. Lots of good things happen. We can cut down the amount of energy we're wasting and especially the amount that we're putting into fossil fuels. By the way, if you're in the part of the world where a lot of your energy is generated by oil-fired plants or coal-fired plants, and you think you're doing something really great by having an electric car, you probably are, but just remember, that's really a coal-powered car or a diesel-powered car or oil-powered car, just because it's the way you get the energy into those batteries. So energy means we've really got to do more than just shift from putting a gas pump into the side of our handle into the side of our car to putting in a electrical plug into the side of our car. We actually have to shift our way of using them. I'll come back to this, but that's not to suggest we shouldn't have cars, or we won't have cars, or we don't want cars. I love my car. I really like driving it. I just wish the rest of you weren't clogging the roads when I'm trying to get somewhere at the peak hour. You know how that goes. It's like our friends, the traffic engineers, often say, we engineers don't mind if you use our roads. We just wish you wouldn't turn on and off of them all the time. It slows things down. Well, obviously, if we reduce the dependence on all that fossil fuel, we also reduce emissions, which is crucial in an age of climate change. There are some other good things, including our own health, because we can burn calories when we walk or bike instead of gallons of gas. And we can make people happier. There's lots of documentation that that's the case. Now, our friends in environmental politics will eventually arrive at those same things, but they usually start with something else. The compact city also lets us retain part of our vast territories in open space, whether it's for productive agriculture or for wilderness, and that becomes harder and harder to do if we wastefully use every scrap of land. So living closer together, big benefits, right? Unfortunately, all of those sound like eat your beans. I learned a long time ago that when I'm speaking to developers it doesn't work all that well to go to them and say, how would you like to help us meet all of these important cultural, social, and environmental objectives? Instead, it works a lot better to go to them and say, how would you like to make more money? And would you like to make it faster and be the hero instead of the enemy of a lot of the people? And that's really where the argument has to go. And many of the discussions today were about not just doing the right thing for the planet, but about saving money by doing it. And that's exactly what we mean when we say reduce costs or add value. And then, of course, offsetting objections to development by being the good guy or the good gal instead of the enemy. Now, human beings, as a species, have demonstrated a tremendous capacity for doing this well. If you look at the phenomenal cities of the past, they are also the results of someone's before and after thinking. Someone drew lines on a map to decide where the street would go. Someone drew lines on a plan to decide where the buildings meet the street and what the details would be. And when I speak of street design, I'm really not talking about just the curbs and the gutters and the lampposts or the street trees. I'm also speaking about the whole ensemble, including architecture, because as this picture kind of demonstrates, if we can think of the street not just as a transportation corridor for moving large numbers of people and goods from one place to another, certainly that's okay, but we can also think of the street as a place where people want to be, then we can achieve much, much more. Now, in order to go down this road with me, so to speak, I want you to think about 3 different lenses through which we can view cities, and therefore their streets. This middle column illustrates one of the lenses. We are accustomed to thinking of cities in this way, a kind of mechanistic way in which it's a machine, inputs, outputs. You turn it on, it runs. That means there's the traffic signals work, and there's enough parking, and the buildings stand up and keep the rain off. It means that when you need to fight a fire, there's enough pressure in the fire hose. Those are the utilitarian sort of engineering ways of thinking about the operation, the mechanical operation of the city. This is incredibly important, so not to minimize that. But there are at least 2 other lenses through which we should also be viewing the discussion about green building. One might not surprise you, because in environmental thinking, we often talk about habitat. The wildlife biologist speaks of the habitat in the rainforest that has species richness. We, by the way, have a lot of species richness or variety and diversity, biodiversity, in human culture. We have families and households that are of all different sizes, incomes, types. We have businesses and institutions, some that are large, some that are medium, lots that are small. Our institutions and government agencies are similar in that way. So our habitat needs to be nourishing just like the wildlife habitat has to be for an endangered species. So we have to have that variety built into it. Crucial idea for street design, because if you have just one standard street in the official manual, and by the way, if that one street is wider than it should be, you are probably failing your complicated species, which needs different places of different character and qualities. There's a third lens, which is to think of the city as a great ongoing collaborative work of art that's never finished. And that's what makes it memorable, what draws us to it, what makes us devoted to it and loyal to it, what makes us come back to a place over time and spend money year after year to live there or be there or buy things there. So the art is not extra. It's actually the key to competitiveness. It's what makes people want to be in the place where people want to be. Now, as the introduction mentioned, and thank you for that, John Massengale and I wrote a big fat book on street design that came out in January because we were inspired on this topic, and the Prince Charles wrote the foreword to it. I have one copy of it left. It's a sellout, so we're delighted about that. But I'm going to show you a little bit of what we learned through taking this 3.5-year journey to write the book, and we shot 18 or 19,000 new pictures. We did a lot of drawings. 500 or so of them are in the book. The reason for it is so that an elected official or a developer or a designer or a planning director or a neighborhood leader could go into a meeting with, say, the Ministry of Transport or the mayor or the staff and turn to a page in that book and say, why can't we have a street that beautiful and functional and desirable in our neighborhood? If just one of you does that, it will have been worth it to write the book. Here's the lesson that we learned in doing that research and trying to boil it down to some principles. First, remember, street design has always been a hallmark of advanced civilization. We use our streets not just to move back and forth, but to send messages, to communicate about the importance of the institutions inside our buildings or the place we were trying to create, the shining city on a hill. And when we make sometimes very, very simple, inexpensive choices, like drawing a line on a map and then planting street trees in a row, similar species, close spacing, like this, look at the gift we give future generations. The gentleman in this picture is on his daily commute. By the way, in a miserable climate. He would love to have the heat and humidity and sudden storms instead of the snow he deals with all year long. The gift he has is that his daily commute is through that almost cathedral-like experience. Do you see what happens? He would no sooner trade that experience for a car trip, right? Than you would, say, eat a fast food meal instead of a fine meal at a great Panamanian restaurant. Look at this gift. Here's from the early 19-teens in Charlotte, North Carolina. John Nolan, the Dean of American City Planners in his era, specified native trees planted in a row. And now the people who go back and forth sharing that street have the experience of passing through a climax forest as they do so. So these gifts last. I said last night to our group at dinner that when we draw lines on a map, it reverberates for centuries. It lasts a very long time. And that's the importance of the green building in your city planning, not just your architecture. Now, another thing we remember is that we have all kinds of contexts. We're, as a species, good at making big metropolitan centers in the densest, brightest parts of the region. We're also good at making small towns and tranquil suburban neighborhoods. It's all of the above, not just one or the other. So as we traveled around taking pictures of places and then staying up late at night arguing about what made them special and why people seemed to reinvest in them, it did come back to this one test. Is that street scene, that one segment maybe, just one block of that transportation corridor, a place where people want to be? When we had that, we found all sorts of other benefits and values followed, like economic robustness, like affordable housing, like peace and tranquility and privacy, which I mentioned earlier. These are new houses on a street in South Carolina, but they were built the old traditional South Carolina low country way, with a front porch in conversation distance to the sidewalk. So that kind of thing means we've got to get command of more than just the dimensions of the lanes and how many lanes there are, but command of the whole building to street relationship in order to use what we've learned from the history of city building and street design. Now, there's another part to that history. Our species also, for a very brief time, I would say basically a historical aberration, it will probably be seen, we started doing this instead. We began making streets that weren't places where people wanted to be, but instead we designed our habitat for the vehicles themselves instead of their occupants. And it became quite tragic. In fact, it created a kind of disposable, throwaway real estate that is incredibly expensive. And not just on the commercial strip arterial roads, but also in the simple residential subdivision. Look at the size of the street here, where all of the specialists have gotten just the number of meters of width they wanted for their purpose, whether it's turning fire trucks or putting cable TV under the street or what have you. Everybody got exactly what they wanted, except the pedestrian. And if you compare that to just a time not very long ago at all, when street space was shared, before we organized everything around the car, in fact, at a time when Broadway in New York, which is running down the middle of my tie, had no traffic signals or stop signs or crosswalks, and they didn't even have a concept of illegal jaywalking somewhere other than the corner. The street space was shared, and emphasis was actually on the walls of the public room through the architecture, not so much on the sidewalks. So a lot of north Central and South America declined in the public realm. I will say it also happened in many, many parts tourists don't visit in Western Europe. It certainly has happened in North Africa. It's happened in highly motorized places like Australia. So our experience in this part of the world is not unique. Now, I think there's a tension in the imagery that floods into your eyes when you come to a place for the first time. And yesterday, for the first time, I was able to see that tension on display here, where on one hand, you're lovingly restoring the old part of town, the Casco Viejo. You're also very rapidly urbanizing areas that were suburban or rural before. And there is this tension between whether to make people habitat or car habitat. Well, maybe it's not a tension. Maybe there's too much car habitat, but I'll let you decide that. But there is this, I think, challenge for your green building movement. Meanwhile, worldwide, what we're finding is that the creative populations that drive the modern economies Mark described are very picky about their habitat. They want to be in one of those places where people want to be. They also want to use the streets, and they're coming back in, sometimes on 2 feet, sometimes on 2 wheels, and saying, ready or not, here we come. Those streets are for us as well. And it's an interesting time. Back to New York, not long ago, the New York Transportation Commissioner brought out a crew in the middle of the night and put big planters with flowers in them and boulders and epoxy paint on movable tables and chairs out, and took space back away from the cars and gave it to pedestrians in the form of this plaza in front of the famous Flatiron Building at Madison Square. And the next morning, New Yorkers streamed out of those buildings and down into those movable chairs adjacent to those tables. They knew exactly how to use that space, and it will never become car habitat again. So very rapidly and very inexpensively, we can actually undo some of the damage that has been done. The benefits are vast, and not just in terms of emotional benefits, but also in terms of convenience. I took this picture when David Rodriguez and Madi and I were in Bologna a few years ago. If you live in that apartment, you can walk just half a block down the street and visit with this fellow and buy fresh food, fresh fruits and vegetables. And the people who live in that apartment have been able to do so for the last 350 years without once making a car trip to accomplish that errand, because they live in a mixed-use and walkable community of the type that Marissa described. Or imagine the people here in New Orleans, where they had to install a streetcar line as part of their transit plan. Instead of just putting down tracks and buying train equipment, they built the wonderful St. Charles Avenue median, which is like a great linear park through their neighborhood. It's an amenity even when you're not using the streetcar. And if you look closely, between the tracks, those worn spaces, they're used by joggers. They're not fenced off and told stay away from the dangerous transit vehicle. They just run there, or they mountain bike on those spaces, and then when they hear the streetcar coming, gentle little bell, they step out of the way, it goes by, they get back on the path, and they continue their run, and the world doesn't come to an end. So without great expense and without great complexity, we can actually build places which are inherently multimodal and desirable. This is a newly built neighborhood. This may be coming on 18 or 20 years old now. Which people were very skeptical about, again, in the low country of South Carolina, because the houses were so close together in a place where they're not accustomed to that in new suburban development. Well, as it turns out, that these lots here are about half the size of the lots in the neighboring subdivision. And the houses are pushed even farther close up to the street. They also sell for twice as much. So they're 6 times as valuable on a per square foot basis than the auto-oriented subdivision that's immediately adjacent. So there's a mounting body of evidence that there's money to be made in the placemaking approach to green building, as if we didn't have enough evidence from the great places worldwide that have been built simply by being careful about drawing lines on a map. Location is the most important factor, but look at what design can do. Here's my argument. If you want to be sustainable, then you need to be competitive, and you're not just sustainable environmentally, but you're sustainable economically and socially as well. Well, here's the radical idea, doesn't just require gadgets. It requires love. It requires beauty. And at least eventually. You can get along so far by putting better insulation in your buildings for a little while, then everybody else puts better insulation in their buildings too. The market is transformed and you're back to even. The only way to consistently win is to make a place people love more. And here's why. Desire drives our choices, not doing what we're told because it's good for us. And desire is how we make real estate decisions. Real estate choices are at least 80, some say 85 or 90% emotional. All other things being equal, which one looks better? Which one will we like being in better? Which one has more curb appeal, to use the term real estate professionals also use? These are emotional decisions. Now, those of you who are developers, I met a few yesterday and more last night, I know you're accustomed to spending money to get that emotional decision to go your way. You hire a good graphic designer to design a beautiful logo for your project. You hire great videographers to produce impressive video material that you can use to advertise your project. You hire just the right supermodel to appear on your billboard, and you select the name very carefully. These are all about making the emotional choice easier for your customer to pick your building to buy or lease space in instead of the other person's building, right? This concept that I'm talking about, making street designs where people want to be, is the same idea. Daniel Burnham, the city planner who designed one of the train stations that showed up in Mark's slideshow, said once, "No one ever created a commodity as valuable as beauty, and no one ever will." Because the beauty is what separates your address, and therefore your building, from everyone else's similar size, similarly priced building. For sustainability, the street design has a kind of veto power over it. You can have a terrific location. This is a really good location. And if you have a poor street design, you can sterilize the possibility that people will walk, bike, or use transit, or drive less, or conduct their errand on foot midday and park once for the day instead of 4 times because of the street design. Here's a street where we know there's officially a sidewalk, but no pedestrians can be witnessed in that location, and probably none ever will be witnessed in that location. So think about before and after. It means coordinating public and private effort. Here's the hard part. I'm challenging you to design your private buildings and get a better public realm at the same time, which means you need to do what they did in Winter Park, which is rethink the street design and rethink the rules for making buildings at the same time, or at least the customs. So here are new buildings and a new street installed not too far apart in time and conceived as one, thought about as an ensemble, one big design and planning problem that was both public and private, and therefore it needed a very open and transparent kind of way of making the plan. We'll consider this part of Chattanooga, Tennessee, where they started off with very traditional buildings on the new street that held the plan together, but eventually they arrived at exuberant modern buildings as a vocabulary for the neighborhood. Those actually coexist quite nicely in the same neighborhood. So just for this one takeaway message, don't confuse what I'm talking about with architectural style. So the kind of thing you can accomplish with modern buildings or traditional buildings, high classical buildings or boomerang-shaped buildings if necessary. It's really more about how do these buildings meet the street. So I'll leave you with 5 things to look for in the great streets of the near future. First, they have a shape like a public room. That comes from the placement, well-proportioned placement of buildings, their height to width relationship. This is why urbanists are so interested in land development regulation and getting the form-based codes right, or knowing where we are. And sometimes you do that with individual buildings that are detached from one another. Sometimes you do it with the big buildings that are attached to one another. Second, they have to be climate adapted so that when we're out there in that space, we feel comfortable. Certainly nowhere is it more important than in hot, humid places, like in the subtropics. And yet we have throughout the tropical regions great architectural traditions, arcades, colonnades, skinny streets, shade, which are part of making that possible. So here are a couple of those examples, the trees or the canopies, architectural elements which make pedestrians happy being out there. How about this one? Does that look like comfort? Yeah, not so much. You may have to advance that one manually. I don't know, AV, you've got that. There it goes. Okay. Third idea is that the streets that are successful in the way I've been describing are actually connected to their surroundings, part of a larger urban fabric, not like the suburbs. And so if you compare the number of intersections per square mile, one of those things that lead for neighborhood developments makes you spend a lot of time carefully counting. You'll find that in the traditional cities, they have small blocks and therefore a lot of intersections. And in auto-oriented suburbia, they have very big, supersized blocks, relatively few streets, which have to do all the work, take all the traffic, and on very few intersections, which are always jammed. And so comparison in this connectivity way is really important. The new urbanists got a little bit better about this over the last 20 years, and we've seen practice improve. These maps are all at the same scale, so you get the idea of comparison. But just so we don't get cocky, we have a long way to go. There's Rome, more than 1,000 intersections per square mile. Now we know that mixing land uses and building at higher densities will reduce our carbon footprint. Did you know that making a more connected street pattern will do the same thing? In fact, after a certain point, the number of intersections is reached, then your carbon footprint will drop like a rock, partly because of all the additional modes of travel that are activated, partly because of the quick trips to where you're going to park and get out of your car. So very late in the creation of our book, we made a little section on street networks. The fourth idea is that it has to be safe. You don't want to be afraid of getting run over, and that means speeds have to be slower. That little circle in the bottom picture is how much we can see when we're driving 30 miles per hour. That's the cone of vision, according to the National Association of City Transportation Officials. And then working up from the bottom, 30 miles per hour at the bottom, 25 just above it, 20 second from the top, and 15 miles per hour at the top. Look how much more we can see. And we're moving more slowly, so look how much more time we have to react. That's why when there is a collision, and we shouldn't call them accidents, when there's a collision between pedestrians and motorists, just a little bit of increase in speed makes a huge increase in mayhem. And that's why also thinking about the different kinds of users, not just the motorists, but also even our cyclists are divided into many different kinds of populations, should be part of our design. Safety also means what Jane Jacobs called eyes on the street. So doors and windows are better than blank walls because they have natural surveillance. Once again, we only get that from properly regulating the development, the building to street relationship that has to be recovered. The last test is more difficult. It's the one that has to do with making a great experience, and it's different in every place. But we tried in the book to create a lot of measured drawings so people could see how much the street curves, how wide the street space is, and that kind of thing, from a whole collection of historic streets of different kinds. There are some surprises. The most beautiful parking lot in the world isn't a parking lot, it's a street. The Avenue Diana actually has 300 parking spaces per block on the street. In the classic tree-lined multi-way boulevard, you wouldn't even think it's a parking lot, and yet it has a vast number of cars parked there on every single block. We look at skinny streets and skinnier streets and streets that are so steep they need to be like steps. But I think the most important thing we've done is look at the streets that need to be changed, the streets that we start off with and imagine how they might be better. And they're, at this point, 20 plus years into the new urbanism movement, lots of examples to point to. Our own town here in South Miami looked like this in 1992, and just a few years later, that dead space had been turned into the social center of the neighborhood. We didn't have to go build in a new place. We transformed the place that we had. Or the most beautiful retrofit we found, Kensington High Street in London, which used to have fences to keep the pedestrians penned in, now looks like this. So as we travel, we keep looking for more examples, and we're finding that it doesn't matter where you go, in what climate, in what culture, you're going to find the street space is the most important thing for making great addresses. And so I keep collecting them. If you find some you want to contribute to that, you can use Twitter and you can post them, hashtag Street of the Day, and we'll all take a look together. Thank you very much.
Para el señor Saulo Núñez, la siguiente pregunta. ¿Dónde están las escuelas? En la separación de residuos, todo lo reciclable va junto, botellas, plásticos, cartão, etc. Y luego, ¿qué pasa con ello?
Ok, na primeira pergunta, onde estão as escolas, na concepção do projeto nós tentamos ver se colocava uma escola, assim como, por exemplo, uma clínica médica. Esses são itens que só viriam a enriquecer o projeto, mas a gente não consegue viabilizar a escola, porque fruto dos terrenos que estavam muito caros em São Paulo, e a gente não consegue viabilizar outro tipo de serviço, mas realmente seria fantástico se a gente conseguisse. Aliás, houve uma passagem há 2 anos atrás, onde uma escola nos procurou, perguntando se a gente poderia vender uma das torres para trazer uma escola que era um braço de Harvard para lá. E a conta não fechou, não viabilizou, não conseguiu pelos custos. E a segunda pergunta é que o fracionamento em 3 partes do resíduo orgânico, o reciclável e o comum foi a melhor estratégia que nós vimos para resolver o gerenciamento de resíduo, porque desta forma nós não precisávamos fazer o beneficiamento nem do reciclável e nem tampouco do orgânico, promovendo assim, vamos dizer assim, dando mais vida até às cooperativas que existem na região. Então é muito melhor, como o condomínio depois de entrega, o empreendimento depois de entrega, ele não vai poder receber dinheiro por conta do orgânico que ele vai gerar. Então é muito melhor que eu ceda que as cooperativas venham buscar esse orgânico, eles manipulem e façam disso adubo e paguem a condução desse material até as cooperativas, e assim também no reciclável, ou seja, as cooperativas venham buscar esses materiais para que eles continuem reciclando, do que eventualmente o condomínio, o empreendimento como um todo, viabilizar, produzir isso e não poder receber, porque é uma figura que não consegue receber dinheiro, não consegue emitir fatura. Então, essa foi a maneira mais correta que a gente achou para alimentar as cooperativas, pequenas cooperativas de trabalhadores que existem na região.
Bien, la siguiente pregunta es para Mark Weiss. ¿Puedes hablar de la estrategia de revitalización urbana de los proyectos Hope 6?
The translator asked if you could repeat the question.
¿Puedes hablar de la estrategia de revitalización urbana de los proyectos Hope 6?
Oh, Hope 6. Oh, okay. Yes, Victor and I were talking about this earlier. The Hope 6 was a revolution in. There's a famous quote that, never let a crisis go to waste. So when we walked into office in January of 1993, there had just been a study done called the National Commission on Severely Distressed Public Housing. And they said there are all these high-rise units, many of them which were vacant, 88,000 units in the U.S., that really, instead of continuing to pump little bits more money to, fix them up, patch them up a bit, they should just be demolished. And there was an appropriation of funds to do that. And but then the question is, what would replace them? So we jumped on this pot of money, this competitive pot of money, and we said we're going to create a whole new standard of livable communities based on what we call the 5 mixes, very Chinese. So mixed income, mixed use, mixed ownership, meaning home ownership and rental, mixed density, and mixed financing. We actually brought in private sector financing, and it created a new standard. It was kind of shocking, of livable communities. And in fact, I can tell you, we were joking about this, that when we required, because the money came to the federal government, but the city housing authorities had to compete to get the funds. And so one of the criteria that was worth 10% of the total points, you know about LEED, so you know about points, was for what we called innovative and creative community planning and design. And we said what we mean is new urbanism. And actually the new urbanists up till then had only been doing kind of high-end suburban projects. So it was also a change for the new urbanists, most of them, to then get involved in low-income urban communities. And we even had this course at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University that all of the Housing Authority executive directors had to take this course for 2 days to learn about the new urbanism. And so then they thought, well, if we want to win, we'll go hire the architects of the new urbanism to design the project for us, which they did. And it was really pretty amazing. I invite you to look at the before and after of these projects and how it really changed the whole pattern of in low-income communities that then became mixed-income communities and much nicer places to live and work. It even included commercial facilities, educational facilities, and so forth. Now, the one controversial part, and then I'll stop there, is that in order to reduce, keep in mind, a lot of these units were already vacant, so nobody was living there. But to the extent people were living there, we said if we're going to reduce the overall density and have it be mixed income, so it's not all extremely poor people, that meant that some of the people that were living there got subsidized housing somewhere else. So that there was quite a hue and cry about that. Why do we have to move? But in our view, there was nothing that in the U.S. Constitution that said if somebody was living in a government subsidized apartment that they had the right to live there for generations. Especially since there's so many other poor people that didn't have that privilege. So that was controversial, but overall, in terms of a whole new pattern of urban revitalization, I'm very proud of Hope 6. I think it was very successful.
Para la ingeniera Marisa, ¿cómo podría Panamá Pacífico mejorar sus condiciones de las comunidades vecinas al proyecto como Veracruz y Arraiján?
Bueno, desde un punto de vista, si hablamos de la responsabilidad social empresarial, nuestra empresa tiene un programa de responsabilidad social donde nos integramos los colaboradores de London and Regional Panamá con la comunidad de Veracruz. Por varios años ya tenemos un programa con la comunidad, específicamente en la Escuela Cosecha Amistad, donde los colaboradores vamos y enseñamos inglés para fortalecer el sistema educativo de ese colegio en los niveles de primaria. Una vez por semana, un grupo de colaboradores va y ayuda en ese lado, que es de la parte de responsabilidad social empresarial. Definitivamente que por la parte económica, el impacto del proyecto también ha sido bastante positivo hasta el momento, ya que muchos trabajadores vienen del área de Veracruz a trabajar dentro de Panamá Pacífico.
Para Saulo Núñez, ¿cuál fue la estrategia urbana más importante que incorporaron en el proyecto de Sao Paulo? La repito. ¿Cuál fue la estrategia urbana más importante que incorporaram en el proyecto en Sao Paulo?
Nós achamos que todos os itens que nós colocamos no projeto, eles meio que se completam. Mas diante da questão do trânsito das grandes metrópoles do Brasil, eu acredito que, e do mundo, eu acredito que um dos grandes fatores que a gente desenvolveu foi criar alternativa para que as pessoas deixem o carro em casa, com os transportes alternativos, incentivando o uso de bicicleta, incentivando a divisão de carros. Eu acho que esse vai ser um impacto, vamos dizer assim, diretamente, onde a gente pode contribuir para o desenvolvimento da cidade.
Para el señor Mark, ¿cuáles son las mayores fortalezas que percibes en tus 2 viajes a Panamá que nos pueden ayudar a implementar una estrategia económica de desarrollo sostenible?
Well, one of the things that's been interesting to me is, we've done a lot of work in Singapore. We have an office there, and if you look at, there's a book by the great Lee Kuan Yew, the great leader of Singapore, called from third world to first. And if you look at Singapore in the 1960s, was a very poor place, way poorer than Panama has ever been. But they had these, they started with 3 assets. One, you know, because it was a British colony, and then when the British left, they had a world-class seaport. So they knew they could compete in logistics. So that's very similar to the Panama Canal. They, because it was an administrative center, they already had an infrastructure and people trained, you know, in kind of business services. So again, that's a big driver here: business, financial, professional services. And they had this other big advantage in that part of the world, which is a lot of people spoke English. You know, these were people that were ethnic Chinese, ethnic Malay, ethnic Indian, but a lot of people spoke English. And so they parlayed that in the case of Singapore in a strategy that won't work here, which is which was focused on manufacturing. Because I don't think the way the world is today, Panama can't compete at the lowest labor compared to China, and it doesn't have the a large-scale, advanced, skilled workforce to compete at the high end like Silicon Valley. But I really do think that when I look at Panama, that where Panama can compete beyond what it's already doing is by being a super sustainable place. That you have a lot of smart people. You have a burgeoning over the last decade development industry. We're building buildings like crazy, commercial buildings, residential buildings, and so forth. So you don't have to do something that you're not already doing. So that's a huge asset. You take what you're already doing and transform it and convert it through education, through research, through technology, through bringing in the private sector and building a consensus. This is what we're doing in Rio Grande do Sul. This is our future. And if this big development industry gets behind this with the government support, you can make it happen. You can become like Singapore is in this sense. Singapore prides itself on now being a very sustainable place with a high quality of life. So a lot of companies want to be there, a lot of talented people want to be there, a lot of people want to live and work there. You could go way beyond where you are now by starting with the green buildings, because that's something that's you're already building buildings. And then it would take longer, but this is kind of what Victor's talking about, or these examples we see from Marissa and Saulo, of having a mixed-use pattern that's more walkable, that's more bike-friendly, that's more transit-oriented, and ultimately solving this huge traffic nightmare. And I'll just say this, you know, yesterday we were in a van coming back from a trip, and we had to be back at the hotel by a certain time, and at a certain point I said, let's just get out and walk, because it took, we could walk in 5 minutes, and it was going to take about 25 minutes for the van to cover the same distance. When you have traffic that bad, obviously you need to make changes, and you can do that step by step, and then starting with the green buildings and with new development, you can ultimately have a very sustainable place. To me, that's the best winning strategy for Panama, and you have the assets now, which is all you people in this room, smart people, to actually do it.
Thank you. Víctor, en tu corta visita a Panamá, ¿cuáles son las principales áreas de oportunidad en Panamá que deben ser solucionadas para aspirar a tener diseños de carreteras como las que mostraste en tu presentación?
That's a great question. You know, a friend of ours, Fred Kent, recently said that if you design a city for cars and traffic, you're going to get cars and traffic. But if you design for people and places, you get people and places. And as we traveled around yesterday, although that was just merely a brief glimpse, it's pretty evident, not just in the public right-of-way, but even in the space between the edge of the roads and the buildings, or the buildings were set back to their regulated location, that the priority has been seeing how many vehicles you can jam into the space. So suggestion would be, see how many trips that are being made by individual occupants in a single occupant car trip you can replace or shorten, so that not only will you not be fighting with as many people to use the same intersections at the same time, but you also won't need as much space to park them all over town when you move from here to there. Now, you're making inroads in that regard. Obviously, it's a big celebration right now that you've opened the first segment of a full-blown metro. Amazing. That's terrific. And so that will be the start of a lot of investments, maybe not all of them that big and expensive and technological and underground. Others of them simpler. Let me put it like this. The reason there is a tension between economic development and quality of life is that people assume that in order to get more economic development, they have to trade down their quality of life. It doesn't have to be that way. In fact, you might imagine that if you're going to get, say, this much additional traffic congestion coming from economic development, well, if you get this much economic development and this much new traffic congestion, that might be tolerable. It's a fair change. You live with becoming more like a dense, bustling city. Maybe that much congestion is even like good cholesterol instead of bad cholesterol. But what if you get this much economic development and you have that much traffic congestion? And doesn't it seem like that's what's happening? I mean, we look around at the newly built places, and I can tell just looking at it that you got a boost of economic development, and you got an even larger, more frustrating boost of traffic congestion in the same bargain. And that's because the pattern is disconnected. Even when the densities are high, the uses are separated. And the assumption is there that so many of the trips will be made by cars. So let me put it this way. If you are witnessing that car culture is choking your streets, and it's choking your quality of life, and it's choking your planet, and that spending billions of dollars every year in an attempt to solve it by building your way out of problems with wider and faster roads is in fact futile, because the wider and faster roads just attract more cars to them, then why spend billions of dollars on that instead of a few $100 million on the things that will actually make the difference, like walking, biking, and using transit? The things that traffic engineers, the transportation engineers often call the alternate modes of travel, although I would argue that walking is not an alternate mode, it's the original mode.
Para Saulo, ¿cuánto cuesta la operación del sistema de gestión de residuos sólidos del Parque das Cidades? ¿Cuánto cuesta? ¿Cuánto cuesta la operación del sistema de gestión de residuos sólidos del Parque das Cidades?
Os investimentos para equipamento de gestão de resíduos, incluindo o recolhimento do resíduo a vácuo, gira em torno de 1% do custo da obra. Não é?
Bien, ya respondió.
Não foi essa a pergunta?
Sorry. Okay.
A gente sempre evita falar em todos os itens quanto que foi os investimentos, mas eu acho que isso, a ordem de grandeza, ela de certa forma valoriza o sistema, porque ele traz uma série de benefícios para o empreendimento como um todo. A gente evita falar em investimento, isso é uma regra inclusive da empresa, mas de qualquer forma é uma solução técnica que evita transporte vertical e horizontal do resíduo no entorno do empreendimento.
Bien, acá hay otra pregunta para el doctor Mark, está escrita en inglés, así que se la voy a pasar. Tiene que ver sobre la visión del gobierno en el cambio de la ciudad y también de la sociedad, de qué depende. Acá está en inglés.
Says, we should start promoting change in our city, ? Should it begin as part of the vision of the government, ? Or should it depend on the society? Question mark. Okay. This is for Mark and Victor. So, I will answer this. It always depends on both. So, I can, if you remember in the Washington, D.C., the image I had of the Washington, D.C. plan, it was the economic resurgence of Washington, D.C., citizens' plan for prosperity in the 21st century, not the government plan. When we did this plan, we involved thousands of people. We had all these task forces, and ultimately we had a representative group of 30 key leaders where we went through in agreeing on the strategy and the 40 key actions to implement the strategy that had to be bold and innovative, that had to follow the strategy itself, because we had thousands of suggestions, and this was one of the most important things. We said it had to either be done within a year or at least started within a year, and this was the best part. For each action, we picked a group. Sometimes it was an existing group, like a business group, like the Green Building Council. Sometimes it was a group that we formed that was in charge of implementing that action, with 3 co-chairs and a group of people actively involved. And of the 40 actions, only 7 of them were the responsibility of the city government. So 33 of them were in the hands of the private sector, of communities, of the civic sector, and so forth. And I can tell you how important that was, because we did the plan where the federal government, during a time when the federal government had basically taken over the city government. And then after that there was an election, and there was a new mayor, and the federal government gave the power back to the city. And the mayor at first had this question. He said, well, it's not my plan. He said, I should have my own plan. And so he started going around and speaking to all the business groups, like the Green Building Council and all the community groups. He said, I have a great idea. I think I want to do an economic development plan. And they said, you're crazy. We already have a plan. We like the plan. It's our plan. We own the plan, and we're doing the plan. We just want your help. So after 6 months, the mayor gave up, and he said, okay, this is my plan. And then when he ran, and it was such a big success, when he ran for re-election, he ran on it, and it was his plan, and he was in for 8 years. And so now today, a lot of people remember it as this mayor's plan. So I don't even get the credit for it anymore, but I'm perfectly happy with that, because this is the only way it really works. You're going to have to, you take the leadership and get everyone involved. The government is vital, there's no doubt, but they're just one of the stakeholders and one of the partners in having a really successful process. And this is exactly the way that we're approaching it at Rio Grande do Sul. Even though our client is the state government, we're reaching out to the private sector, to academia, to local governments, because if everybody doesn't get involved, it really won't succeed. And this is kind of the way we always approach it. Either everybody wins or nobody wins. So this is not us versus them. This is, we're all in it together.